All right, the subject this morning is going to be on what did I name it? I'm also woefully inadequate when it comes to creativity of titles and such. A spiritual conflict, and the emphasis is going to be on spiritual warfare. And this was a journey I kind of started wandering down unknowingly about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And it was the year that Halloween fell on a Sunday. And I figured I'd take a break from my normal routine and I would teach on spiritual warfare. Because that's too perfect to set up, right? You just got to take advantage of an opportunity like that. It also in the back of my mind is like, oh, that'll be easy because I kind of know where I'm going to go with stuff. That's famous last words, it seems, when you think you already know what you're talking about. I put most of my message together and then I stumbled onto something. And that ran me down a rabbit trail, so my spiritual warfare break took me all the way through May instead of one Sunday. So the challenge this morning is I'm going to try to give you guys a recap in 5 messages this weekend of what took me about 7 months to go through on a Sunday by Sunday basis. But it was something that really opened my eyes. I want to share it with you guys. And it kind of started in Ephesians chapter 6, because if you're going to talk spiritual warfare, where does your mind typically go right off the bat? And I was in Ephesians chapter 6, and I've always kind of wondered a few things just based on how the standard run of things goes when you're through this section. And you're probably familiar with most of it, but in chapter 6, verse 10, you've got, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." And of course, there's the adversary, right? The devil. Do you ever wonder why it's small d? I thought proper names were capitalized. But we got a small d here. And I don't know, maybe that's just a translation thing or whatever, but it kind of would jump out at me once in a while. It seemed kind of odd. Then we get to verse 12, and it says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood." And I'm going to stop there for a second, but based on most of the messages I heard, if we had just said, "but against Satan," that would have summed up the rest of the verse based on typical approach, right? We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. Our battle is against Satan. But that's not exactly what the verse says. It says we wrestle against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places, and literally in the heavenlies. Oh wait, so we got more than one opponent. Oh, that's usually explained away. That's the devil and his demons, his cronies, right? And how many times we blame, the demonic activity, or the demons take the fall for anything that Satan doesn't get accused of. And I thought, well, what are these demons? How did they become subjugated to Satan and so forth? There's got to be more out here. Of course, then, wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God. And actually, what's interesting, too, is when you get down to verse 16, it says, "Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked." And that one is always, well, that's Satan again. So wait, the principalities and powers, they basically are summed up as Satan. The devil is Satan. This is Satan. If you back up to Ephesians chapter 2, you've got this guy, or this individual, in verse 2. I'm sure you're familiar with this one a little bit, too. It says, "Wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience." Oh, that's Satan too. Well, okay, and maybe it is, but it doesn't call him Satan there. We got all these names floating around. You got this group of entities that it claims we are battling against. And I started digging, and I found out that I can't come up with many answers as to anybody who could explain what these entities were, and how they operated, and who they functioned against. So I thought, well, if we're going to start a spiritual warfare conflict, we kind of have to know who we're going up against, right? And that got me doing some digging. And I always hesitate to mention names, so I'm not going to. Some of you may have stumbled across this journey as well. But on a Saturday around noon, right as I was kind of wrapping my notes up for Sunday, I stumbled across someone talking about Psalms 82. And actually, I've stumbled across quite a few people who now talk about Psalm 82. And it opened up a can of worms. So I'm going to open up the can of worms for you if you haven't been down this road. And we'll do some comparisons here. I better grab my notes so I at least know where I'm going with this. Psalm 82 seems fairly straightforward when you start off. A psalm of Asaph. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. Now, growing up, the presentation, or earlier in my life, not even growing up, but as an adult even, I was always told there's only one God, and when you see small g gods, they're either not real beings or they're just whatever. But what's pointed out to me here is when you see the word God here the first time, we've got the Hebrew word Elohim. And typically in most theology books, you will find it be told that the name Elohim is a personal name of God. And when you see that, it's usually referencing him. It's something that's a designation for, I'm going to break out some other terms, but either Jehovah or Yahweh, depending on the terminology you want to use. The problem is, so that's fine, right? God, as we know him as Jehovah, standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. Here's the problem. He's judging among the Elohim. So wait a minute, now we got an issue. Because if Elohim's an individual name for God exclusively, we got to come up with some creative idea of working our way around this, right? And some have. It's basically that God is interacting within himself amongst the rest of the Trinity. There's an issue with that, though, because what does he start doing when he's judging? What does he do to the other members in which he's judging among? Verse 2, how long will ye judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Doesn't quite sound like a conversation God would be having within himself. So here we've got God as Elohim in the midst of these other Elohim, and he's judging them for doing things incorrectly. Verse 3, just for the sake of it, it's a short chapter, defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy, deliver the poor and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said, ye are gods, for the record. There's our word, Elohim again. And all of you are children of the Most High, but ye shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. And I wish I had time this morning to dig into all of the various different angles. Some people say, oh, he's referring to mankind, here. And it's, of course, Jesus quotes this in the book of John, I believe it's chapter 10, where he said, he's having a discussion with the scribes and Pharisees, and he says, is it not written, I have said ye are gods? And then he goes on explaining a bunch of things, and they say, oh, that's because he made the Jewish leaders like gods or leaders in their way, and that's not a real consistent run with the Hebrew for starters. Number two, I think Jesus isn't necessarily pointing out that he had made them leaders, but that he was the one who said it. That's why they got mad. The whole issue was he claiming to be God or not? Well, if Elohim stood and said, I have called you gods, I believe Jesus is aligning himself as the one who had done so, and that's why they immediately afterwards tried to kill him again, and he disappears out of their midst. Either way, the other problem with this is in context, were the Jews ever put in charge of the nations to rule over them? Not at this point in time. They were having enough trouble getting their own act together. So none of the conversation makes sense unless God's speaking to somebody who's not human and not himself. So does Elohim potentially refer to another group of individuals that are out there? For the record, I haven't done the count, but as I understand it, the word name Elohim shows up approximately 2,000 times. And most of those times, it is a reference to God himself, Jehovah. But here's the thing about Elohim. It's a unique word. It's kind of like our English word for sheep or moose. It can be singular or it can be plural, and oftentimes it doesn't refer to God himself in the context. We do know a few things about them. They are referred to as the sons of God. Down here in verse 6, I have said ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. If you've been down the spiritual warfare road a little bit, the sons of God phrase might jump out at you, but they are referred to in that type of terminology, used as such. And also interesting terminology we're going to bring out here in a second is that phrase, the Most High, all right? They're supernatural beings. If you back up to go down to Psalm chapter 89, And we'll start in verse 5. Start in verse 5. And the heavens shall praise thy wonders, O Lord, thy faithfulness. Oh, for the record, when you see Lord all in capital letters, you've got your name Jehovah, or prior to the anglicized pronunciation or English pronunciation, it would be Yahweh. All right? For who in heaven can be compared unto Yahweh? Who among the sons of the mighty can be likened unto Yahweh? Now, interestingly, here again, we got the sons phrase showing up, but it says sons of the mighty. It's the sons of El, right? So here's our Hebrew word. The word mighty is El. So you got your phrase sons of God popping up again. Who among them can be compared likened unto God? God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints and to be had in reverence of all them that are about him. O Lord God of hosts, who is a strong Lord like unto thee, to thy faithfulness round about thee? These individuals seem to be assembled about him in the heavenlies. They're referred to as the sons of God. They also have the concept of heavenlies. And this concept that they reside or have access to the heavenlies shows up in other places. For example, Job chapter 1, starting in verse 6. It says, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Little side note that's kind of interesting. In the Hebrew, the phrase is, I want to get it right, Hasatan is the Hebrew for the phrase Satan. And it's the word, the has, H-A-S, that comes before Satan is actually the definite article, kind of like we have in the Greek. So as Hebrew grammar works, there's actually an argument that that would mean it's describing a position somebody holds, not an actual proper name. Because you would not introduce yourself with the definite article preceding it. That's improper English. It's also improper Hebrew. So it's just fascinating. Not saying it's not the Satan that we know and understand, but at the same time, it could just be that here's a guy who shows up and his job is what? He's an opponent. And it's interesting how automatically even like Strong's goes down, oh, Satan, the archenemy of God. But it simply means an adversary or somebody who opposes another person. And what's going on? It's almost as if he's been wandering around the earth looking for people doing the wrong things so he can report that to God, perhaps. And when God asks for a report, he gives him one. And so kind of fascinating. And it's repeated in Job chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came, and there's your Has-Satan again, came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And so you've got this conversation. But there we got our sons of God residing in the heavenlies and so on and so forth. So you got all these Elohim. The English word that's been used to translate this is gods, small g. So the first response for a lot of people is, wait a minute, are we wandering down some polytheistic genre or whatever the case may be? And here's the conclusion I've kind of come to. The word Elohim has nothing to do with a personal name for God or any gods. The word Elohim is a general designation that describes I always hate using certain words because it sounds bad, but like a species as it were, right? So you have human beings are a particular race of beings. Elohim are another race of beings, but it's a very broad and encompassing term that gets applied to a lot of different things. Let's give some examples. We'll start at the top here. Just once again, to re-emphasize that the name Elohim is definitely a designation for God. Oh, here's maybe one way to say it. God is Elohim, but not all Elohim are God. Maybe that's a fair way of describing this. But in Deuteronomy chapter 4, I kind of did this too to try to save a little flipping if need be. But chapter 4, starting in verse 35, I always like a little context. We'll start in verse 33. Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire as thou hast heard and live? Or hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by a stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Unto thee it was showed that thou mightest know that the Lord, he is, and here's our word, Elohim. There is none else beside him. So we know that God himself, Jehovah, is Elohim, but what else does it possibly flow in on? We kind of already referenced Psalm 82, where you've got these Elohim that seem to be within some form of a council or entourage, as it were, because you've got him in the midst of them there in the heavenlies. They're referred to as the sons of God. We kind of talked about that one. I'm going to jump to the next one on the list. Here's one that's interesting. Let's go to Judges chapter 11. And this was funny because you see the word God's small g pop up when you're reading through, right? And I always kind of just played it off. Oh, it's idols, or it's some inanimate object, or it's some whatever, religious object of sorts. Well, once I realized that the word God's oftentimes is the word Elohim, I started kind of looking. Every time I'd stumble across one, you quick grab the concordance, or if you're I'm usually on my phone, I'll grab it real quick and look at it. And the word Elohim pops up everywhere. Almost every time you see the word God, small g, you have this word Elohim. And the significance to me about that is the fact that he's not just talking about inanimate objects. All right, let's start in verse 23 for some context. Judges chapter 11, verse 23. So now the Lord God of Israel hath dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel, and shouldest thou possess it? Wilt not thou possess that which Chemosh, thy God, and I won't pull it up every time, but every time you have the H430, that's our word Elohim, thy Elohim giveth thee to possess? So whomsoever the Lord our God shall drive out from before us, them will we possess. So Chemosh, one of the gods of the Amorites, is actually described not just as an object of stone, that was a dumb worship form or whatever we look at as how ridiculous type of a thing, but he's actually designated as being backed up or associated with a spiritual entity. Another example of this would be 1 Kings chapter 11. This one kind of builds on this thought. 1 Kings chapter 11. And we're going to drop all the way down to verse 33 area. For the record, you always get the mocking statement, oh, those ignorant, barbaric races that just built this, carved some random stone into an object and then placed all their worship and faith in it. How naive could you be? They weren't that naive. What they would oftentimes do is the idol really wasn't considered the god. It was the host that they hoped the god would come and inhabit more or less to make a connection point. So they would actually have a ceremony after a statue or an image was made to that god, basically requesting that the god, the spiritual entity, would use that as a channel to the people within. So they weren't worshiping a chunk of stone or a piece of wood they hacked out of a tree. It was a spiritual entity that they had basically that stone or piece of wood embodied, more or less. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 33, because that they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess. Here you go. Doesn't even have to be gender specific, I guess. Wouldn't that appeal to the modern society, right? It's our word Elohim right there. Ashtaroth of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the Elohim of the Moabites, and Milcom, the Elohim of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments as David his father. So all these gods suddenly are being identified as being Elohim and so forth, but it gets even better yet. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy chapter 32. And verse 17. And I'm going to have to bail on some context, so I'll let you guys do that homework at home. But for time's sake, I'm just going to stick with my specific verse here. But it says basically, they sacrificed unto devils. That's not our word Elohim yet, but not to God, to gods, to Elohim, whom they knew not, to new Elohim that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. As I understand, though, the grammar in that particular verse does draw a connection between devils in this particular instance and the gods, because they're sacrificing and worshiping devils as Elohim. And for the record, it's a completely different word there. As you can see, shed is the Hebrew word for devils. But notice the wording. They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to Elohim, whom they knew not. So even the demons are referred to as Elohim. And one more, this is kind of the cherry on top that I feel like sort of puts the whole concept of what an Elohim is together. It paints the full picture. 1 Samuel chapter 28. On Wednesday night we were here and it was brought up that we probably might visit this one again. And sure enough, for the sake of context, we won't go through the whole story, but this is the situation where Saul goes to consult the witch of Endor, as we know her. And this is a really funny one if you start digging in and looking, asking questions and researching, because a lot of people will say, "Oh, she was a hoax. You can't do that, really. You can't interact with the dead." It's interesting that God made a law that forbid, witchcraft and associating with spirits. Why would he do that if you couldn't do it to begin with? God didn't say, "Thou shalt not steal," because you really can't steal anyway. No, it's because you can. And I believe the reason he forbade the activity was not because it was something that, "Oh, it's just a hoax. I don't want you dealing with all these scam artists." No, it's because you could. And I think this woman seems to be one of those who seem plenty equipped to handle the situation. Basically, Saul's trying to find an answer about a battle coming up. The Lord's not answering him. Samuel's dead. Prophets have nothing. The Urim and the Thummim won't give him an answer. The only thing he's got left, the only guy that his entire life would actually take the time to converse with him in any way, was Samuel. And so he's going to go try to see if he can literally dig Samuel up from the grave, more or less. Starting in verse 8, Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, "I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee." And the woman said unto him, "Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done." Disguise must have been fairly decent, because she didn't know who he was at this point. "Now he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die?" Anyways, verse 10, Saul sware to her by Jehovah, saying, "As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing." Interesting how God gets dragged into this scenario a little bit. That's maybe another discussion for another time. Verse 11, "Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel." Verse 12, "And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul." I'd love to know more about this scenario, because what happened with what she saw? He asked for Samuel, so if and maybe she wasn't fully expecting to get Samuel. She's using a familiar spirit to pull this off, it seems. But at some point in time, she realizes, this is Saul right in front of me. Saul's not worried about that part of it. Verse 13, "The king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw Elohim ascending out of the earth." Well, so Elohim, was it some spiritual being or entity? No. Verse 14, "And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself." Sure seems like Samuel's being identified as an Elohim. The idea of an Elohim simply means a spiritual being, and there's a lot of them. When we go back to Ephesians chapter 6 and says there's principalities, powers, mights, dominions, spiritual wickedness in heavenly places, our battle isn't just exclusively with one being and his minions, as it were, necessarily. There's a lot of individuals serving a lot of functions. And it appears that when somebody passes beyond this physical life, they also move into the realm or the existence of being Elohim. Now, we'll keep drawing this picture out. I got some time yet. But Samuel bears that description as well. And I want to just throw this out. I'm not going to explain it yet. It says back in verse 13 here, "I saw Elohim ascending out of the earth." Plug this in the back of your head for a moment, because we're going to come back to this one. The word earth is eretz. All right? That's going to be next session. But if I forget to reference it, I wanted to make a mention of that now. All right? Okay, so moving on. We've got all these Elohim. Does that mean there's a bunch of supernatural, all equal beings running around doing whatever they want. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, all of the Elohim that are in existence beyond Jehovah are actually called to worship him. Some examples, Psalm chapter 95. Psalm 95 and verse 3. For Yahweh is a great God and a great king above all Elohim. There we go again. So he is the ruler of the rest of the Elohim. Christianity does, because for the record, we're not polytheistic all of a sudden because there's lots of small g gods running around. There's only one true God. He is the Lord God. Another example, Psalm 89. Let's back up a couple chapters and starting in verse 6. For who in heaven can be compared unto Yahweh? Who among the sons of El can be likened unto Yahweh? God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints and to be had in reverence of all them that are about him. And for the record, wouldn't it be kind of a weird phrase to say, who is like unto God? Who can be compared unto him? If there wasn't even somebody in the conversation that could have filled the other side of it. It's like, if you only had one football team, well, who could ever beat them? Well, no one. There is no other football team. But when you actually are drawing a comparison amongst a bunch of beings who are similarly designated, who is like unto God? There is none like unto him amongst the Elohim. But it's a weird conversation to have. And I don't know, I remember that jumping out to me one time before. It's, thou shalt have no other gods before me, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Well, I guess jealous of stone, but it runs a little deeper than just some object you place out in front of you there. Psalm chapter 97. Let's throw another one out there. Psalm chapter 97. And we'll do verse 9. For thou, Yahweh, art high above all the earth. Thou art exalted far above all the Elohim. So the Elohim are subjected to him, but do they serve a function? What is the purpose for all these Elohim? We had in Psalm 82 that God was ruling in the midst of them. If they're all subject to him, but there's this interaction going on, we kind of saw that in Job, right? There's this, hey, what have you been up to type of a, if I can paraphrase it that way. What are they doing? And it appears actually from multiple areas in Scripture that God actually has a council or a group of these Elohim that he interacts with on a somewhat regular basis. Let's throw out a couple examples of this. 1 Kings chapter 22. This is why it took me 7 months. But you ever look up the answer to the question, why did God create man? Maybe you've asked the question, maybe you've heard somebody preach on it. And I'm always intrigued because the one that usually kicks up is to worship and serve him. That seems like a very, very popular response. And I'm not saying that either one of those is incorrect. But I've come to the conclusion that I believe what God really wanted was more of what we would recognize as a family relationship with those he created. And I believe he created the angelic host, as we call them. For the record, the Greek kind of sums all of these entities up and calls them angels. The Greek doesn't have a word that seems to parallel Elohim, so that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. An angel simply means a messenger. Just like Satan means an accuser, right? It's more titles for what some of these individuals are doing, perhaps, than an actual designation. But the Old Testament, the Hebrew seems to very clearly call them out as Elohim. And these individuals, God didn't just create them so that they would be, praise me 24/7 and I'm good with it. Seems like he wanted some interaction. He wanted some playback. He wanted to see their creativity, their thought processes come into play. And I think 1 Kings chapter 22 is a phenomenal example of this. And we don't have time to cover the whole chapter. So we'll hit a few spots. Starting in verse 1, though, we'll get a little context. It says, they continued 3 years without war between Syria and Israel. And it came to pass in the 3rd year that Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel said unto his servants, know ye that Ramoth and Gilead is ours, and we be still? Take it, and take it not out of the hand of the king of Syria. he said unto Jehoshaphat, Wilt thou go with me to battle to Ramoth Gilead? And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as thou art, my people as thy people, my horses as thy horses. So basically, the king of the northern tribes of Israel is getting together with the king of the southern tribe. He wants to go take the city back. He's trying to develop an alliance between the two. And Ahab's ready to roll. Jehoshaphat's, let's do some homework before we just set out, right? So in verse 5, it says, And Jehoshaphat said unto the king of Israel, Inquire, I pray thee, at the word of the Lord today. And Ahab obliges. It says, The king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said unto them, Shall I go against Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall I forbear? And they said, Go up, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hand of the king. 400 men, that's a pretty persuasive argument, right? Jehoshaphat's not quite confident in that message. Verse 7, Jehoshaphat said, Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides, that we might inquire of him? And I love the humor that comes out in some of these stories, if we just kind of take a moment to actually look at it. Verse 8, And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, There is yet one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. Basically, I don't want to listen to him, because every time I ask him a question, he gives me bad news. But he's going to oblige and sends a messenger to go get Micaiah. And it's funny, because the officer shows up and basically kind of appeals, hey, look, you kind of got a reputation. Everything's going good for the king. Can you just kind of go along with the way things are going? And let's see, let's drop down. So eventually Micaiah gets back to them, and let's see, I'm going to jump to verse 15. So Micaiah shows up. So he came to the king, and the king said unto him, Micaiah, shall we go against Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we forbear? Same question. And he answered him, Go and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hand of the king. Now, I'm sure Jehoshaphat was very happy to hear that, because that was the answer he was looking for. But Ahab's now the skeptic. And the king said, verse 16, unto him, How many times shall I adjure thee that thou tell me nothing but that which is true in the name of the Lord? So basically, I know you're not telling me the truth here, because this isn't how it normally works. Verse 17, here's where we wanted to get to. And he said, this is Micaiah, I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills as sheep that have not a shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master, let them return every man to his house in peace. And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, Did I not tell thee that he would prophesy no good concerning me, but evil? And he said, Hear thou therefore the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right hand and on his left. We're getting a glimpse into the throne room of God, that council session taking place. And Yahweh throws out a question, verse 20. And the Lord said, Who shall persuade Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Did God need to ask these guys how to get this job done? No, he could have figured it out himself. He could have struck them dead all on his own. But does God want interaction? Is he looking for some form of relationship with the individuals around him more than just, stand around and give me glory? You notice the wording that's used. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, what? We have received the adoption of sons, whereby we may cry, Abba, Father. Aren't we referred to as the sons of God? Weren't the angels referred to as sons of God? The terminology is that of a family-type relationship, not one that's just these beings out there to do the yard work, more or less. Like, Adam and Eve weren't just his gardeners. He wanted more out of them, and we may or may not get into that. But moving on with this. He asked the question, and a bunch of these individuals around the throne start giving answers. In verse 20, one said on this manner, another said on that manner. And there came forth a spirit and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said unto him, Wherewith? And he said, I will go forth, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, Thou shalt persuade him and prevail. Also go forth and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord hath put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these thy prophets, and the Lord hath spoken evil concerning thee. What's interesting about this is this was not God's idea specifically. This was another individual's idea. He's taking counsel from his group. And obviously as God, he can decide whether he's going to use that or not. But he says, okay, that works. Go do it. There's an interaction taking place within this council. Another example, real quickly, Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. Oops, chapter 4, there we go. And I'm going to have to look that one up in here because I didn't write down the exact verse, but I think I can find it really fast. Here we've got Nebuchadnezzar. And this is when Nebuchadnezzar got a little full of himself. And he's going to get in a little trouble here. Actually, let me do this real fast. Funny thing is I just looked at this to make sure I had it. And here we go. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a tree, grows up, becomes really strong, it's hacked down, so on and so forth. When he gets to the end of his dream here, he says in verse 13, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. And he cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump. All right, so here's this individual that comes down from heaven, and there's this decree that this tree is going to be cut off, obviously symbolizing Nebuchadnezzar's fall for 7 years where he lives as a beast in the field, if you read the rest of the story. But notice down in verse 23. And whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one come down from heaven, saying, hew the tree down, destroy it, yet leave the stump and the roots in the earth, even with a band of iron. That's not the one I wanted. Oh, verse 17. Okay, this one didn't bring it up. Back up to verse 17. Sorry. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. It's not designated as the decree of Yahweh. This is the watchers, these holy ones, who requested this form of disciplinary action. Then when you get down to verse 23, what does it say? And whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven and saying, hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump and the roots thereof in the earth, even the band of iron. Just drop down to verse 24. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. So whose decree was it? Well, ultimately, Yahweh makes the final call. Who were the ones, though, who are attributed with the concept or the idea? It's the watchers. There's an interaction taking place between these individuals as they, as God's using them in such a way to have relationship in a great and strong way. And what happens is, and what we're going to see in sessions here coming up, is that some of the members of this council decided they weren't quite satisfied with their position in it, and they wanted more sway. And we're also going to see that these gods that we identified that came in with all these nations, there's a reason they're there. And it's not just because the people necessarily were willy-nilly inviting any random local spirit in. There's more at play at that. But as of right now, just for the starting session, I just wanted to identify. We got to kind of know our opponents, and I know this was a brief run through it, but the Elohim are playing a huge role in things, and we're going to see that coming out in action here shortly. But we'll go ahead and wrap this session up with that for now, so we can kind of try to stay on schedule and pick up here in about 15 minutes.